One day, a black teen is tasered by a cop just for trying to live his life. What the officer doesn't know is that the teen's father is not just anyone. He's the police commissioner. What happens when the truth comes to light and everything changes forever? Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The small town of Greenview was peaceful on the surface, with the occasional schoolyard scuffle or speeding ticket, but beneath the calm exterior, tension simmered. The police force, though well-respected in the community, had faced criticism recently, especially from the black residents who felt that their voices were being ignored. Greenview, a town with low crime rates, seemed like the kind of place where everyone should get along. But the racial divide was widening. People of color, particularly the black community, were beginning to feel like outsiders in their own hometown. Among them was 17-year-old Malik, a high school senior with a towering frame and dreams bigger than the small town that surrounded him. Malik had spent his whole life battling more than just the physical challenges on the football field. From a young age, he understood that society often saw him differently because of his skin color. He wasn't just a teenager aspiring to be a professional athlete. He was a black teenager in a world where every move he made would be scrutinized, and his dreams often felt like they had an invisible wall blocking them. But Malik didn't give up. His love for football kept him grounded, his friends kept him hopeful, and his father's encouragement kept him determined. Malik's father, Commissioner Wright, was one of the few black faces in leadership roles in Greenview's law enforcement. Despite his high-ranking position, he often felt the weight of both his responsibilities and the societal expectations that came with them. The struggle of balancing his identity as a black man in a predominantly white profession never left him. He worked tirelessly to improve relationships between the police force and the black community, but the challenges seemed endless. Malik saw how his father carried that burden daily, and while it made him proud, it also made him painfully aware of the world's harsh realities. Across town, Officer Davis walked the streets of Greenview, his mind weighed down by the demands of his job. At 35, he had seen more than his fair share of crime, and also more than his fair share of moments that made him question the system he had dedicated his life to. Though well-meaning, Officer Davis had struggled to fully grasp the racial dynamics that played out in his interactions with the people he served. Raised in a predominantly white neighborhood, he hadn't always understood the complexities of race relations. Now, as a police officer in a town that was increasingly divided, he found himself caught in a tug-of-war between doing his job and confronting the biases he had never fully acknowledged within himself. Both men, Malik and Officer Davis, were shaped by the same town but were living in two different worlds. Malik's world was one of struggle and aspiration, a world where every day felt like an uphill battle to prove himself. Officer Davis's world was one of duty and expectation, a world where the pressure of being a good cop sometimes clouded his judgment. Neither knew that their paths were about to cross in a way that would change everything. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Malik was out on the football field, doing what he loved best. His friends were running drills, laughing, and forgetting about the problems that weighed heavily on their lives. For a few hours, they could escape the harsh reality of their town and just be kids. But in Greenview, even a moment of joy could turn dangerous. In the blink of an eye, the game they were playing would shift from something innocent to something much darker. It was the kind of afternoon that felt like summer was still holding on, even though the calendar said it was nearing fall. The air was warm but not oppressive, a light breeze rustling the leaves as they drifted lazily across the empty streets of Greenview. Malik and his friends were on the worn football field near the edge of town, kicking the ball back and forth. For a few hours, they could forget about everything, The stares, the whispers, the pressures that came with being young and black in a town where everyone knew your name but not your story. Malik's legs were beginning to feel the burn as he sprinted after the ball, a perfect pass coming his way from one of his best friends, Marcus. He leaped, catching it in midair and landing gracefully before jogging back toward the makeshift end zone. His chest heaved with excitement. "Man, I'm gonna make it to the NFL, I just know it," he said, throwing his arm around Marcus's shoulders as they walked back to their starting point. "You gotta keep that focus, Malik," Marcus laughed, giving him a shove. "You're already looking like you belong on the field." "Yeah," Malik said, grinning, "and I'll make it big. One day I'll be the one everyone's watching." The sounds of their laughter and friendly trash talk filled the air, the kind of noise that could make anyone forget about the issues waiting back home. But the peace wouldn't last. From the corner of his eye, Malik saw the shadows of figures moving quickly on the street that bordered the field. At first, he thought it was just a group of people passing by, maybe another set of kids looking for a game. But then the voices rose, and the tone shifted. "You can't just walk away like that." "Don't act tough with me." Malik's heart dropped. A fight had broken out a few blocks down. He knew the kind of trouble this could bring. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in Greenview. The neighborhood had a mix of tension, especially on weekends when people let their frustrations spill out onto the streets. Malik didn't want to get involved. He had enough to deal with: football practice, school, and the pressure from his father to stay out of trouble. A fight wasn't something he needed to be near. He glanced at Marcus, who was already motioning for the others to stay low. Malik nodded, and the group moved toward the edge of the field, trying to keep their distance from the noise that was growing louder. But it didn't matter. The situation escalated quickly. It wasn't long before people from both sides of the street began shouting at each other. Malik could hear the curses and insults being thrown, a mix of angry voices rising into the air like a storm. Then came the unmistakable sound of objects being thrown: trash cans, glass bottles, whatever they could grab to fuel the chaos. Malik froze, unsure of what to do. His friends were backing away, but he wasn't about to run. Running would make him look guilty, like he was afraid. So he stood there, trying to be as invisible as possible. Maybe if he stayed quiet and didn't make eye contact with anyone, the fight would blow over, and he wouldn't get caught in the middle. But luck wasn't on his side. Just as Malik turned to walk back, trying to distance himself from the mess, he saw a car pull up on the street, the flashing lights of a police cruiser cutting through the haze of commotion. He didn't need to see the officer's face to know it was Officer Davis, the same cop who had been patrolling the area for years. Malik had seen him around town, always quick to pull people over for the smallest of infractions. He wasn't a bad guy, Malik thought. Just one of those cops who didn't know when to stop and listen. Always ready to jump in and take control, but maybe not so ready to understand what was really happening. Officer Davis had already spotted the group of people near the fight, and instinctively his eyes moved to the figures he knew best, the group of black teens on the edge of the field. His hand went to the radio on his shoulder. "We've got a situation down here. Need backup," he muttered into it. Malik's heart began to race. He didn't know why Officer Davis was targeting them. Maybe because they were the closest group, maybe because they had been standing still for too long, but Malik knew exactly how this could go down. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and suddenly, everything could spiral out of control. The cop stepped out of the car and started walking toward them. Malik's eyes locked with his. He could feel the tension building between them, thick enough to touch. He tried to keep his posture calm, tried to show that he wasn't part of the fight. He wasn't involved. He just wanted to go home. But Officer Davis wasn't giving him the benefit of the doubt. "Hey!" Officer Davis barked. "I said stop!" Malik froze. He didn't know whether the command was for him or someone else. He glanced over his shoulder, hoping the officer might be talking to someone else. But no, the officer's eyes were fixed on him now. You! Officer Davis pointed directly at Malik, his hand tightening around the taser at his belt. Stop right there! Malik's mind raced. Why was the officer focusing on him? He hadn't done anything wrong. But the moment his gaze met Officer Davis's, something in the officer's eyes clicked. A judgment, a presumption. Malik knew it was all happening too fast, and the adrenaline was making it harder to think clearly. He opened his mouth to explain, to tell the officer he wasn't involved in the fight, that he was just trying to get away from it. But the words stuck in his throat. He was too scared, too confused, and all he could think was, if I run, I'm guilty. If I stay, it's going to get worse. Stop! Officer Davis repeated, now closer, his voice sharp. I'm telling you to stop! Malik's heart pounded as his feet started to move, backing up slowly, trying to give himself space to think. He wasn't resisting arrest. He wasn't running, just trying to get away from the escalating situation. But Officer Davis misinterpreted it. The tension in the air was thick with fear and confusion. The officer saw Malik's retreat as defiance, as disobedience. And that's when Officer Davis made the decision. Before Malik could turn fully around, Officer Davis reached for his taser and fired. The sharp crack of the electric current filled the air, and before Malik knew what was happening, his body locked up, and he fell to the ground, his muscles seizing as the shock coursed through him. Malik's vision blurred, his chest heaving for air he couldn't seem to catch. He could hear the officer shouting at him, but it felt distant now, like the sound was coming from far away. The taste of fear was bitter in his mouth as he lay on the pavement, completely paralyzed. The world felt distant to Malik as his body writhed on the pavement, the taser's electric jolt leaving his muscles paralyzed, locked in place. His head spun, his breath shallow, and every nerve screamed in pain. His chest rose and fell erratically, his body fighting against the unrelenting shock. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He wanted to scream, to shout out that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he wasn't part of the fight. But all that came out was a strangled gasp, his voice lost in the chaos of the moment. Officer Davis stood over him, his face a mix of authority and confusion. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hand still gripping the taser. The tension between them, so thick moments before, now hung heavy in the air. The officer's breaths were quick, shallow. It was clear he hadn't expected this outcome, this confrontation. But it was too late to take back what he'd done. Malik lay there, his mind foggy. The sound of sirens grew louder, but everything felt muffled, as if he were underwater. His vision blurred, and he could barely make out the officer's figure looming over him. Then, something shifted. As Malik tried to regain control of his senses, he felt a cold, hard object hit his side. His phone, or rather, it had been his phone. The shock had caused it to slip from his pocket, clattering onto the concrete, followed by something else, a stack of papers, documents, slipping free as Malik's body spasmed under the intense electricity. The papers scattered across the ground, their edges fluttering in the breeze. Some of them came to rest by Officer Davis's feet. At first he didn't notice. His focus was still on Malik, his hands gripping the taser, unsure of what to do next. His breath was ragged, his mind racing. But then something caught his eye. The papers. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning over the documents that had spilled out. His hand reached down instinctively, picking up one of the pages. His brow furrowed as he read the name at the top of the sheet. Commissioner Wright. It was a simple piece of paper, nothing more than an official document, but it struck him like a punch to the gut. He paused, his fingers tightening around the edges of the sheet as the name stared back at him, bold and clear. Officer Davis's eyes widened, his heart racing. He looked down at Malik, still on the ground, twitching in pain, his body trembling. Then he quickly scanned the other documents. They were all related to the police department. Confidential memos, department directives, letters with the commissioner's signature. It was all becoming clear. The realization hit him with a gut-wrenching force. The teenager he had just tasered, the one he had assumed was just another troubled kid caught up in a fight, was the son of the very man who was in charge of the entire police force. Malik's father was none other than Commissioner Wright, the person Davis had sworn an oath to serve under, the man responsible for the very rules Officer Davis was meant to uphold. Davis's breath caught in his throat. A wave of nausea washed over him, and his hands shook as he looked down at Malik, now struggling to regain some semblance of control over his body. The young man's chest was still heaving, the taser's effects slowly beginning to wear off, but the damage was already done. Davis's stomach churned, a cold sweat forming on his brow. It was one thing to make a mistake, but this was a mistake that could destroy everything. "God," Davis muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the magnitude of what had just happened. He had tasered the son of his boss, someone he had worked with every day. This wasn't just a bad decision, it was a betrayal. Davis's legs trembled slightly as he knelt beside Malik, dropping the documents in the process. Malik's body was still stiff, his breathing labored, but the shock was beginning to fade, leaving only a deep ache behind. Davis hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed, guilt twisting his insides. This wasn't supposed to happen. Malik, can you hear me?" Officer Davis's voice was softer now, almost apologetic, though it still carried an edge of authority. But Malik didn't respond right away. He couldn't. His body wasn't ready. His head was spinning. His limbs felt like they were made of lead. But slowly, Malik's breathing steadied, and his eyes fluttered open, blurry at first, but then focusing on the figure standing above him. Malik's chest heaved as he tried to sit up, wincing with every movement. His body felt sore, heavy, like he'd been through a storm. He saw Officer Davis standing there, the officer's face pale, a mixture of confusion and regret. What did you do?" Malik's voice was hoarse, his throat dry from the electric shock. He blinked a few times, trying to clear his vision, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I didn't do anything. I wasn't even part of the fight." Davis's eyes were filled with regret as he knelt down beside him, his voice trembling. I know, Malik. I thought you were involved in the fight. I thought you were running. I thought you were resisting. But I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "Why did you taser me?" Malik's voice cracked, the frustration and pain in his eyes evident. "Why didn't you listen? You could have asked. You could have." Davis's face tightened, guilt flooding his chest. He looked down at the ground for a moment, ashamed. He didn't know what to say, what words could possibly fix this. But as he looked back at Malik, the weight of his mistake felt even heavier. Because Malik's father, Commissioner Wright, was the one man in town who had been working tirelessly to bring change to a police force plagued by racial bias. The one man who had tried to bridge the divide between his community and the law enforcement that was supposed to protect them. And now, Davis had just made his son a victim of the very system Commissioner Wright had been fighting to change. Before Davis could speak again, the sound of sirens grew louder. He turned, his heart sinking as the flashing lights of more squad cars illuminated the street. Backup had arrived. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Malik was hurt, and now his family was going to find out. The news of what had happened to Malik spread quickly through Greenview. Word traveled fast in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. By the time Malik was released from the hospital, bruised, still shaken, and nursing the after-effects of the taser, his family was already reeling. Commissioner Wright stood in his office, his fists clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight with anger, but there was something deeper in his expression, a weariness, a heaviness that only someone in his position could understand. He had always known the challenges that came with his role, the endless balancing act of being a black man in charge of a predominantly white police force. He knew that every decision he made would be under the microscope, that every action, every word, could be twisted or misinterpreted. But this was different. His son, Malik, had been a victim of the very system he was trying to change. And he couldn't escape the bitter irony. Standing in the living room, his wife Sharon was quietly pacing, her face pale with concern. She had always been the rock of their family, the one who held them all together. But today, even her usual calm was rattled. The sound of Malik's voice in the background, weak but persistent as he tried to piece together the events, only made her more anxious. "How could this happen?" Sharon whispered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I don't know," Commissioner Wright replied, his voice tight with emotion. He walked over to the window, staring out at the quiet streets of Greenview. I thought I could make things better, Sharon. I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could change the way people saw us. But this is a step back." Sharon's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. "It's not your fault. You can't control what other people do." "I should have been able to prevent this," Wright muttered, his voice barely audible. "I should have seen it coming. Every day I try to protect the people I care about, but this is my son, and now he's caught in the middle of it all." Malik, still struggling to understand what had happened to him, sat quietly in his room. He had heard the words that were said to him at the hospital. He had heard his parents' voices, filled with worry and confusion. But in the depths of his own thoughts, a darker question kept repeating itself. Why me? Why had Officer Davis singled him out? Why had his skin made him a target? He had been trying to stay out of trouble, just like his father had always told him to. And yet, it seemed that no matter how much he tried to live right, he was always judged by something he couldn't control: the color of his skin. Malik's mind kept replaying the scene: the flashing lights, the sharp pain, the terror as he lay on the ground. He had tried to explain himself, to make the officer understand that he wasn't part of the fight, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But the words didn't matter. The assumptions had already been made, and now he had to face the consequences, not just from Officer Davis, but from a world that saw him differently. His father entered the room quietly, his face hard but not unkind. He sat down beside Malik on the bed, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. Malik looked up at him, searching his father's face for answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Dad, why did this happen?" Malik's voice was small, hesitant. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to get away from the fight. But he didn't listen to me. Why did he taser me?" Commissioner Wright took a deep breath, his own emotions threatening to spill over. He had been through this before, countless times, with people who didn't understand, with officers who didn't care. But now it was his son, and the weight of that was a burden no one could prepare him for. "Malik," he began slowly, his voice rough, "you have to understand something. As much as I've tried to change things, to make the system better, to make people see us as equals, there are still forces out there that will always see you differently. You're a black young man in a world that judges you before it even knows your name. And because of that, you'll always have to work harder than anyone else just to be seen as human." Malik listened carefully, his father's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He knew his father had faced racism, had faced discrimination in his own career as a police officer. But hearing his father say it, hearing him acknowledge the reality that Malik had been experiencing all his life, felt different. It felt raw, real. "I know you want to believe that everything will be fair, that if you just do the right thing, everything will work out. But it doesn't always work that way. People will see you, Malik, and they will make assumptions. They'll see the color of your skin before they see the person you are. And that's something you'll have to carry with you every day. It's not fair and it's not right, but it's the truth. Malik sat silently, his mind swirling with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, hurt. His father's words were painful, but they were also the truth. The cold, ugly truth that Malik had been trying to ignore for so long. "But I don't want to be a statistic, Dad," Malik whispered. "I don't want to be just another kid who gets caught up in the system." Wright squeezed his son's shoulder, his voice softening. "I don't want that for you either. But the system, it doesn't see you the way I do. It doesn't see the good in you. It sees only what it wants to see. And that's the fight we have to keep fighting." Malik nodded quietly, his eyes filled with unshed tears. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to process everything, the pain, the fear, the anger that had been building inside of him. But in that moment, he understood something else too. His father's struggle was his own struggle. They were fighting the same battle, against the same forces, and even if it felt like an uphill climb, even if it felt like they were losing, they couldn't stop fighting. Meanwhile, Officer Davis sat alone in his car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. His hands trembled as he thought back to the moment when he had tasered Malik. The regret gnawed at him. He had made a decision that was so far removed from who he wanted to be. He had judged Malik based on assumptions, based on fear, and in doing so, he had wronged him. With a heavy heart, Davis finally made up his mind. He had to go see Malik. He had to apologize, not just for what he had done, but for the way he had viewed people who didn't look like him. When he arrived at Malik's house, the air was thick with the weight of what he had to say. He knocked softly and Malik's father opened the door. There was no anger in the commissioner's eyes, just a quiet exhaustion. "I need to speak with Malik," Davis said, his voice low. Malik was sitting in the living room when Davis entered, his eyes still raw from the night before. But he looked up, and for a moment, their gazes locked. I came here to apologize," Davis said, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was wrong in how I judged you. I should have listened. I should have taken the time to understand what was really happening instead of jumping to conclusions." Malik looked at him for a long moment, his expression hard, but his eyes tired. "You hurt me," Malik said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't see me. You didn't see the person I am. You only saw someone you were afraid of." "I know," Davis admitted, his eyes filling with regret. "And I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much my own biases had clouded my judgment. I never should have done that. I should have done better." For a long time, there was silence. Then, Malik finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I appreciate you saying that." Davis nodded, accepting the weight of Malik's words. It was a small step, but it was a start. The day after Officer Davis's apology, Malik's world still felt heavy. He had spent most of the morning in his room, processing the events of the past few days, the confusing mixture of pain and anger still swirling in his chest. It wasn't just the taser, or even the incident itself, that hurt the most. It was the realization that for as long as he could remember, people had always judged him first by the color of his skin. And while his father had spent years fighting against that, Malik had never really understood how deeply rooted that prejudice ran. But now, as he sat at the kitchen table, his father's calm voice broke through his thoughts. "Malik," Commissioner Wright said, his voice steady, though there was an intensity in his eyes, "I've made a decision. I'm not going to let what happened to you just be another incident. I won't let it be swept under the rug like it always has been." Malik looked up, surprised. His father's words held weight, a promise of change that Malik wasn't sure he believed was possible. "What do you mean?" "I've spoken to Officer Davis. I've already contacted the chief and the city council. We're going to take action, Malik. We're going to make sure that this never happens again. Malik's eyes widened. What kind of action? New policies, Commissioner Wright said, his voice firm. We're going to implement measures that address racial profiling, discrimination, and bias in the police force. Officer Davis is going to work with me with other officers to ensure that the department is held accountable. This isn't just about punishing the system. It's about changing it from the inside out. For the first time in days, Malik felt a spark of hope. He had known his father was a man of principle. But this was different. This wasn't just a plan to protect his family. This was about protecting everyone, regardless of their race or background. I can't do it alone, Malik, Commissioner Wright continued. But with your help, with all of us pushing for real change, we can make it happen. This is the turning point. Your story can't be ignored. Malik nodded slowly, still processing the weight of his father's words. He didn't know what the future would look like, or whether things would truly change. But for the first time, he could see a path forward, one that didn't feel as hopeless as it had the day before. The community of Greenview buzzed with conversation in the days following the incident. People gathered in small groups at coffee shops, in homes, and at the local park, discussing what had happened, how Malik had been wronged, and what needed to be done to ensure it didn't happen again. There were some who argued that it was just one bad decision made by one officer, but those voices were growing quieter by the day. More and more, the conversation shifted toward accountability, toward the need for change, and most importantly, toward the belief that no one, regardless of their race, should be treated differently by the people sworn to protect them. At the local town hall meeting, Commissioner Wright stood before a packed room of citizens, the weight of the moment pressing on him like a heavy cloak. He had spent years trying to navigate the politics of policing, trying to make small changes where he could. But this was different. This was a moment of reckoning. He had no choice but to speak the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner Wright began, his voice steady but impassioned. What happened to my son Malik is a tragedy, but it's also a wake-up call. A wake-up call for all of us, for our police force, for our community, and for our entire nation. We cannot continue to let racism and bias go unchecked. We cannot continue to allow people to be judged based on the color of their skin rather than their character. I will not stand by and watch this happen again, and neither should any of you. It's time for us to come together as a community and demand the changes that will make this town safer, fairer, and just for everyone. This is not just about one officer's mistake. This is about changing the system, making sure that the voices of all people are heard and respected. There was a silence in the room, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of discomfort or uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding. People were listening. And then, slowly, one by one, hands began to raise. People stood up to speak, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. They shared stories of their own experiences, of times when they, too, had been judged unfairly. They spoke about the need for education, the need for training, the need for accountability within the police force. By the time the meeting ended, a new sense of unity had emerged. The town, long divided by unspoken tensions, had come together in the name of change. Back at home, Malik sat quietly in his room, looking at a picture of himself from years ago, when football had been his only dream. He had always believed in the promise of a better future, the dream of escaping the hardships of his upbringing and finding success in the world of sports. But after everything that had happened, that dream had felt impossible. The world was too unfair, too broken. But now, as he thought about his father's words, about the promises of change that were beginning to take root, Malik realized that maybe his dream wasn't so far out of reach after all. The road ahead would be tough. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and struggles. But for the first time, he saw that there was a chance, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been held back by the weight of prejudice. His father had always told him that nothing worth having came easily, that the path to success would always be uphill. But he had never mentioned how much harder it would be to reach that dream when the world around you didn't want you to succeed. Now, Malik understood. But he also understood that the fight was worth it. As he stood up, he felt a sense of determination rise within him. He wasn't just fighting for his future. He was fighting for the future of every young person who had ever been judged before they had the chance to prove themselves. He was fighting for the right to dream, without fear, without limits. He looked out the window, the sun setting in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe. He believed that change was possible. He believed that the future could be different, and he believed that no matter how hard the road might get, he could still reach his dreams. Because now, he wasn't just fighting for a better life, he was fighting for justice. And in that fight, there was hope. Malik's journey from a painful incident to a moment of change became a symbol of hope for his community. Through his father's leadership and the collective will of Greenview's residents, new policies were put in place to prevent racial profiling and ensure that justice was truly blind, regardless of race. Officer Davis, deeply remorseful for his actions, became part of the solution, working alongside Commissioner Wright to transform the police force from the inside out. Malik, though still scarred by the events, found strength in knowing that his story had sparked a much-needed conversation. He realized that the fight for fairness and equality wasn't over, but now it felt more possible than ever before. His dreams of a better future, once clouded by the weight of injustice, became clearer as he saw the beginnings of real change. The story ends with a renewed sense of hope, that one person's struggle, one family's pain, can lead to a ripple of transformation. While there would always be challenges ahead, Malik understood that his fight for a brighter tomorrow was worth every step. In the end, the journey toward justice is long, but with courage, change is possible.